Urbit is an operating system for a global networked computer with a global file system. It has its own virtual machine, programming language, OS kernel, and identity layer. It dubs itself as a clean slate OS and network for the 21st century.
More and more, technology, because it's so pervasive in our lives, software is so pervasive in our lives, it will increasingly also be a political stance. Whereas before, I guess people could write it off as just some nerds doing some stuff on the side. But increasingly now, I think it structures our society.
Hi, this is Sri. I'm a YC alum and a research engineer focused on natural language processing for search.
And this is Will. I'm a YC alum and independent researcher who's worked across e-commerce, cryptocurrencies, and financial industries.
Welcome to the Technium, where we talk about the edge of technology and what we can build with it. An optimistic look at the road ahead. How's it going, Will?
It's going all right. How about you?
It's pretty good. I'm very, very excited for this week's topic. And I think
excited or apprehensive? I don't know.
Both. I'm certainly feeling something, is what I'll say.
Right.
But anyway, before we jump in, what do you have to drink this week?
I got a Bundaberg Guava Sparkling Fruit Drink. It's Australian, apparently. And so I guess I've never heard of it. It's super sweet. I had to dilute it. It's got 86% of your daily allowance for sugar.
Woo.
So,
okay.
Yeah, they should just call it a concentrate rather than a fruit drink.
Yeah. Wow. Well, maybe you'll be super high energy and hyped. Yeah. I've got, what is this? Poppy, strawberry, lemon, prebiotic soda. It's not probiotics, prebiotic soda. So this will do something, some kind of digestive help, I think.
What is on the front? It has holes in it. It would probably trigger people with tryptophobia.
That's true. It says strawberry.
I see, it's a strawberry.
Yeah.
So what are we talking about this week that we're so excited about? And apprehensive.
Yeah. So this week we are talking about Urbit. Urbit is an operating system for a global networked computer with a global file system. It has its own virtual machine, programming language, OS kernel, and identity layer. It dubs itself as a clean slate OS and network for the 21st century. So there's a lot to unpack there, but basically,
what does it all mean? What's it all mean?
Yeah, so this is an operating system stack that has been rethought from first principles, and it's been rethought from first principles at every level of the stack. So it has its own virtual machine with its own instruction set called Nock. It has its own programming language called Hoon. It has its own operating system kernel called Avro, and then it has its own application layer on top of that. And then not only this, but it has its own network that's called Ames, and it has its own identity layer called Azimuth. So if you think about every single part of these things, none of this reuses the standard software infrastructure that we're used to coming from Unix and all of that. And instead, they've sort of rethought everything from the ground up.
Yeah, and it's not just that people are building social apps on top of it, and like the Urbit system has given some thought as to how social networks and messaging systems should work between people, and it reaches all the way up there as well. So we're not kidding when we say full stack. Yeah,
definitely. And yeah, it's definitely a opinionated project. It has a variety of philosophies that it espouses and encodes basically into the design of this operating system. We'll go into all of that. But first, we do have to caveat this by saying that this project is a bit controversial, in no small part due to its creator and initial founder, this guy named Curtis Yarvin. He is a interesting guy, computer scientist, but also a bit of an amateur philosopher. He wrote some blogs under an alias called Mencius Moldbug, where he endorses some fringe political ideologies, specifically against democracy and things like this. So we do have to caveat this by saying that a lot of what we're going to talk about today is the product of his mind, and we can definitely see some of those political philosophies coming through. We'll try to sort of deliver the technical aspects objectively, but of course, as always, when we talk about the second and third order effects, we will get into a little bit of this philosophical aspects as well.
Yeah, so can't wait to get started. So where should we start with the technology? We can go high, we can go low, we can go middle. Where should we start?
Yeah, I think the best place to start, the sort of the core of the Urbit operating system, is the Avro kernel. So Urbit and all of the things that surround Urbit basically exist to support this idea that an operating system can be a stateless function, basically, in the functional programming sense. So, and on top of that, In order to support this, of course, they have their own VM and they have their own networking stack and things like that. But I thought that was the best place to start, is to understand the kernel.
Yeah, I thought the architecture of the OS was actually more interesting than the underlying VM and the language. And maybe it's because the underlying language in VM actually has a lot of the obfuscation that we talked about earlier, the renaming of stuff, that makes it a little bit difficult to understand. I mean, this guy had years, like over a decade and a half maybe, to like come up with all this stuff and put it all together. And we've only had a couple days to kind of do our research and put it together. And so I would say that that's part of the reason why, but so yeah, let's start with that. Like, I also thought the functional aspect was pretty interesting, because I think when it comes to functional programming, it's still not widely accepted by a lot of mainstream developers. And we've only managed to pull everybody halfway. Like, Guy Steele, the inventor of Java, said that Java wasn't for Lispers, it was for C++ programmers, and he was able to drag them about halfway to Lisp. And then in the intervening years, React also managed to drag imperative JavaScript programmers about halfway to functional programming. And so I think Urbit just says, well, I think everybody was too conservative before. There's a good idea here. Let's just take it all the way. Take it all the way to the hoop and see what happens if we just dunk this. And so, like, what would a functional OS look like? Like, what sort of things would it buy us? I think that's the part that stood out to me as most initially interesting.
Yeah, so I think the interesting part about Urbit is the Avro kernel and how it models an operating system as a stateless function. So specifically, how they describe the Avro kernel is that it's a solid state interpreter, meaning that it doesn't have any type of transient state or temporary state, but rather the entire state of the kernel is persisted in this single event log. Every single thing that the operating system has ever seen, all the events that it has received from the network, as well as all of its internal events, are supposedly stored in this event log. And then the Avro kernel is a type of reducer, if you're familiar with like Redux reducers or state reducers from functional reactive programming, in that it takes a state and an input, and then if you apply that function, it outputs another new state and an output. And then you just apply that over the event stream to get to your current state of the system. So yeah, that's something new. It's applying a lot of the concepts that you see in functional reactive programming, but it's applying that to an entire OS kernel.
Yeah, I think for those viewers out there that are familiar with FRP or have looked into the lineage of the current front-end frameworks and trace them back through Elm, like FRP will sound familiar. I think the new thing here is that decided to apply it to the entire state of the world, the entire OS, and say what can we get out of it. And so that's effectively what we're doing here. And also, I chuckled a little bit at the solid state thing. It's similar in that, like, solid state in my mind really represents a different thing altogether, which is like the transistors. And I've never heard anybody else anywhere mention it as solid state. And so you'll find in Urbit that this is the case for a lot of things. And sometimes things are justified, right? Because in the nomenclature, I guess real quick, to kind of flesh out this thing about the naming scheme, the nomenclature in regular technical jargon is sometimes confused. Because, like, we'll talk about consistency, but we'll mean it in different senses in different contexts. Like, consistency in distributed systems is very different than consistency in databases. Like, one is like the state, the syncing of states in distributed system, and consistency in databases, I think, has to do with the transactions and the consistency of the data on the database after a transaction has happened. And you'll find this throughout. And I think because we use it so often, we don't recognize it. And rightfully, sometimes Urbit terminology says, okay, these are completely separate topics. We use the same word for it. Let's call them different things. And then other times it's just, we already had a good word for it. You just wanted to call it a different thing altogether. And so that definitely is a stumbling block for a lot of new users. And so depending on who you are and where you are in your life, like, that's either a good thing or a bad thing. And so either way, I think, like, you need to be able to get past that, to kind of squint a little and see the system for what it is, which is actually like a FRP system applied to an entire OS. Yeah.
And I thought it was really interesting because in some sense that solid state metaphor makes sense to me, in that when I think about solid state, there's sort of no moving parts, right? A solid state, like, disk is as opposed to like a spinning platter magnetic disk, right? And in this case, if you think about the moving parts of a system as being the transient state, the memory of the system, which is not persisted, and things like that, then actually this is the source of a lot of software errors and
Problems,
issues,
yeah.
right? Like this
Yeah.
is the whole thing, right? Like if you
If it weren't for state, like computers would be so easy, right?
Yes.
They also wouldn't be Turing complete, I think. But like if it weren't for state, like computing we would not have to hire legions of programmers to do what we do, right?
Yeah, well, not just any state, but I think specifically transient state. If you are able to capture the entire world, right, and just make that inspectable, then perhaps you can reason about the behavior of the system.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem comes when you have state that you can observe, and then state that you can't observe, but it's somehow doing something that's affecting the behavior of the system.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why for front end, FRP, the Elm architecture, and then the Elm architecture's descendants, things like Redux and those state managers in the React world, the reason why they are so powerful is that they make that state explicit and they make that state observable, whereas previously it was maybe state that was stored in individual DOM elements or in local variables and closures that you can't reach into, things like this. And instead, it just says, okay, you have a single state object, you can inspect it, you have a function that is applied on top of the state object that then gives you your next state at t+1, and you can test this, you can reason about it, you can replay the history, you can do time travel debugging, you can do all kinds of things because you can see the entire world.
Yeah, effectively not just see the entire world, but see you're outside of time now. Like, because if everything is recorded in an event log, you're effectively outside of time. And so when you're outside of time, you can just do whatever you want. A lot of things are easier, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so I thought it was pretty cool. And, at the OS level, there's a lot of interest in making the running of an operating system much more in this sort of idempotent, stateless view. If you think about package managers like Nix and Nix OS, that maybe we should do an episode about, but basically they're trying to say, the configuration of the software packages on your system should be descriptive and reproducible, so then you don't have to worry every time you set up the system whether you ran the right series of steps with the right set of side effects, things like that. And then even things like if you think about Kubernetes or Terraform, where they say for a collection of computers, you should be able to describe their end state, and then there should be a reconciliation algorithm that then gets the system into that state. And then you don't worry about, the sequence of commands, executing them in the right order and the right way such that you get to your end goal. So I think that this is a compelling idea. People are applying it at all variety of levels of running of operating systems, but no one has quite actually said, hey, let's just take this idea and make the whole kernel into this thing, right? And I think that's Urbit's kind of trick that it's done.
say your FP without saying your FRP. Yeah, how do you say your FRP without? Is that the vibe?
Yeah. Well. So Curtis Yarvin, in one of his early blog posts, he said, if Urbit is anything, it's like Connell Elliott's FRP, though with no monads, no gonads, no monoids, or other meta mathematical torture. So.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, like, math has its own set of jargons, but like you said in the previous episode, to be fair, math was there first. So. But yeah, like, definitely, I think it's in some ways it has a point, because like everything in computing is made up. Like, once you understand that the computer is just manipulating symbols without really understanding or ascribing any meaning to them, then the labels and symbols are really arbitrary and they're for humans. And so if there are things that are inconsistent, he's just like, well, if I'm redoing everything, if I'm imagining I am the one that's redoing all this stuff, like, I guess he thought about it in terms of like, what would an alien programming language would be like? But another way to think about it is probably like, what if I was a man of today and I was in a time machine and I went back to the 60s and I had to rebuild all this from the beginning? And so that's effectively what he did. Yeah,
absolutely. So yeah, I think it's an interesting idea. That's the kernel, right? And then, you can go up the stack, you can go down the stack. But I think the other idea is that Urbit is an operating system for basically what is a global networked computer.
Yep.
And so I think this involves going up the stack to understand that there's a network, it's called Ames, that routes events between these operating systems. So like, this is where the fun part comes. Each running instance of the Urbit OS is called a ship. So the Ames network routes events between ships.
Take notes, people.
Yes. And each ship has an address, which is a kind of public key-based address that you can kind of think about. If you're familiar with like ENS and these other crypto identity projects, it's very, very much similar to that. So
ENS is the Ethereum name service system. Yeah, basically it's like a DNS but built on top of the Ethereum system. So basically the names that you generate and buy are things that you own as NFTs, and it's the same thing here. Our favorite stuff, crypto, we just can't get away from it.
Yeah, so this is actually foundational to Urbit this idea of owning your identity by owning this address, because this address is, one, it's something owned by you. It's also minted in this decentralized way, so that this doesn't rely on a central authority to produce these addresses. And once you buy them, you own them, and that's your identifier in the system. They're basically like usernames. And then the other interesting part is that they're sold, and the proceeds from the sale are used to fund the development of Urbit. Yeah, so the addresses are something that you own. They're part of your identity, and they're used to route traffic along the Ames network. And so in order to participate and use Urbit meaningfully, you do have to buy an address. And so this is also part of their design. They want the system to be something that you buy into and you have ownership in, rather than being a walled garden that provides you services for free and maybe in an unsustainable way.
So the service would then have to rely on ad networks or something like that. And presumably people have tried to fight email spam for a long time. They're like, if only you had to pay for email. Well, so now that people are rebuilding these networks, the hypothesis as it goes is that if you have to pay for these identity, you're less likely to want to burn it by sending spam through it, because there's only, I think, 4 billion addresses available. Eventually they're all going to get used up. And so it's not going to be very profitable for spammers if they have to pay $10 per an identity or whatever. I think it's at probably $30 now or something like that. I don't know. Maybe the scam is like insurance that pays way more than 30, but like that's the hypothesis anyway. So that's why it's there. Not only it's playing double, if not triple duty, from funding the foundation to spam prevention mechanism.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the Ames network is run in this hierarchical way. So each address that you own is called a planet. And then higher up are stars and galaxies. And so these are infrastructure nodes, basically, that provide the routing services on the Ames network. And there is some type of reputation system such that, like you're saying, if you own a planet and you're a bad actor that is maybe spamming everybody else on the network, then your star through which your messages are routed could add you to some deny list and then deny you services and just drop your messages, right? And then it would be up to you to find another star who is willing to entertain your traffic. And so through this way, there's some type of reputation attached to your identity.
Yeah, and we'll get to this later, because one of the things that it implies is a social structure, or like some type of way that people would be able to organize themselves, because effectively the stars and galaxies are ways in which you can do some sort of enforcement. And yeah, like that is, we'll talk about all that, but that's effectively what it is. And I think the stars and galaxies also provide software updates, and so I think that's also the case. And so I guess they can stop sending you updates, so your client can no longer be compatible with stuff over time. I think the other thing that is probably interesting is how the update mechanism works. I wasn't able to dive deep into this. Or were you able to do that? Because I thought that because things are functional, like you would be able to send the updates, and like the underlying core VM will stay, but then it just tacks stuff on to the end of the event log, and so you would get updates that way. That's kind of how it works, right?
Yeah, that's my understanding, and these are all kind of very Lispy ideas. Like, so there's an underlying VM which never gets updated, and the creator of this is very proud of this VM language. But the Urbit OS, or the Avro kernel, is just a function, and that can change over time. And so that I believe that the function's code is just part of the OS state, because everything is part of the operating system state, and the operating system updates come as an event on the network, which then cause the kernel, when applied to that event, changes the source code of the kernel itself. Yeah,
and because it's a function, I guess you can always just ship it. You can ship it over and over again because it should be unique. I don't know if they actually hash it or anything like Unison does, but because it's a function, like it's not different every time you try to install it, because like the npm packages, like sometimes they're fetching other stuff and your service could be up or down. And they also, like sometimes if you're compiling C stuff, I think there could be side effects in there as well, right? Like sometimes it's pinging out to stuff. So it's not guaranteed to succeed. And when you know this, it's a little scary when you set up your infrastructure, because like how many times in my Git repository, like if you've ever tried in any long running code base where you try to check out a commit from like a year or two ago, like there's hardly any reasonable expectation that you should have that it'd be able to run, because all the dependencies, like they may or may not be there, or if they are there, they may or may not compile. So in that sense, I think like functional is probably a better way to go.
Yeah, I think so. And you know, there are parallels now to a lot of software projects that are less esoteric, like Nix and NixOS that we talked about is one way of thinking about that. And then also like just for general sysadmin work, like things like Puppet and SaltStack and things. These are ways of basically making idempotent updates to your OS and your running system. Idempotent meaning that you can apply them multiple times and you'll get the same outcome. They don't rely on side effects. Instead, they specify something that you can apply once, or you can apply multiple times and you get the same outcome every single time. And so this is advantageous, definitely, in the case of things like OS updates. Like when you update your Mac, or at least when I update my Mac, it tells me I have to plug it into the battery, or don't run it on the battery, because I suppose if my battery dies while it's applying whatever it's doing, I've bricked my system, right? And that's probably not the case.
Yeah, probably not the case, because it might end up in some indeterminate intermediate state that like the software doesn't know how to recover from, and that's why it makes sure that you try to plug it in and hope for the best, right?
Yeah, basically. But yeah, like you said, in Urbit, all of these updates, actually any state transition, not just these OS updates, are transactional and idempotent, so you don't have to worry about that. Yeah, and so the other interesting thing about the Ames network is that, well, why do you want to do all this? Well, because by joining this network, you are part of this global file system. So you can actually just read data off of anybody's ship. So if you know their Urbit address, you can mount their files, you can run programs that are running on their ship.
With or without their permission?
So you don't require their permission, but the data can be encrypted, right? So if you might just be reading garbage, but you can actually just mount any data available anywhere. So it's all part of this global namespace that's prefixed by your Urbit address. And then the security model is basically, is it encrypted and available or understandable by you or not?
I see. Yeah, because then if all the programs are functional, then you can just copy them around, no problem. It doesn't actually matter whose computer they are on, I assume.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, and the files are just structured data that's structured in this data structure that these functional languages that this whole system is built on, Hoon and Nock, run on. And so it kind of, you get the serialization and deserialization for free because it's sort of vertically integrated. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah,
and it kind of reminds me a bit of like Plan 9.
Yeah, one of the things that was also interesting was they folded serialization and deserialization as part of the purview of the programming language, because a lot of programming languages throw that as somebody else will worry about it as a third-party developer or something. But because it was built with a network in mind, it took serialization, deserialization pretty seriously, and so it made it so that serialization, deserialization should really have an acronym for that, like modem.
SERDI.
SERDI? Is it? SERDI. Okay. SERDI is type checked, and because it's the core data structure is really simple, it could be easily verifiable, because like a lot of times the exploits can happen across the network explicitly because of bugs in the deserialization of these network packets that Urbit is trying to get rid of that as a potential attack surface. So I thought that was a nice thing. It was nice.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a lot of good ideas all around, right? If you cut through the noise, but the last part where I think there's the most noise, and I think we won't dwell too much on, is Hoon and Nock. So Hoon is a high-level functional programming language.
Right. So just to give our listeners a map, we first started with the kernel, we went up to identity, and now we're going down in the stack. So like
we're going down in the stack.
Right. Below, under the kernel, it's written in Hoon, a typed functional programming language.
Yeah. And you can think about Hoon as playing the role of C in Unix, right? This is the language that applications are written in, and in fact, most of the kernel itself is also written in.
Yeah.
And then there's a virtual machine that Hoon runs on called Nock, and Nock is a Turing-complete set of basically 30 rules that transform data recursively into other types of Nock data, and it's written in a very funny way. So the only mathematical operation that is available in this virtual machine is integer increment, and 0 represents true and 1 represents false.
Yeah, and apparently the justification was like, oh well, C programmers like indicate success with a 0 and any other number is false, so we might as well do it that way. And I did learn that later on. This was an early decision, and this is one of the few things that the creator regrets, but everything else he's just like, I stand by my work. And so I mean, I guess everybody has their regrets, and so this is one of them.
Yep.
So Hoon, it looks really weird to a lot of people, and I think, like I said before, like syntax is a big stumbling block for any programming language, and so a lot of the new ones nowadays will decide to model themselves after a C-like language or JavaScript-like because it's familiar enough to people so that they can get to kind of more meaty ideas so they don't get stuck. But here they decided, well, I guess one of the things that they did was to make a comparison with mathematics, to say like mathematics used to be written in prose, and that was really complicated to understand. And if you've ever seen one of the examples, I would also agree, like trying to describe a mathematical formula without mathematical notation in prose, it's actually quite difficult to know what the hell they're talking about. It's hard to parse. Like, even though math is seemingly hard to parse for people that don't know all the symbols, like once you do, you're like, okay, like I see generally what's going on here. He makes the same argument for that in programming. So what we'll do is that the major operators in the programming language will be represented by rune, and a rune is basically two characters together, like two symbols, like a bar and a dash, or a colon and a question mark, stuff like that. And the Hoon language is littered with this stuff. And so I think that's the thing that kind of trips people up initially as well. But then I should also remind our viewers that there's plenty of other languages like J and K. Like, if you haven't heard of them, look them up. Maybe we should do a future episode on it. But like, they are derivatives of another language called APL by the famous Iverson. He did one of the famous like computer demos for Computer Interactive. But anyways, like APL is an array-based language that has its own symbols, which requires you to have a special keyboard in order to program in APL. So Urbit is not taking it nearly as far as some of these other ones. So we'll do a future episode on that at some point. But like, I thought that was pretty funny. But I think the last point I'll make on that is that one of the reasons for the runes is that he wanted to make a backbone of 2-character runes so that you can follow the sequence of expressions top to bottom, as opposed to other functional languages where you're getting that callback hell sort of thing, where you get that triangle. And so I'm not sure that I exactly buy that either, because like you do have the pipe operator in Elm, or the pipe. I forget what that thing is. Pipe angle backgate to kind of have everything in a backbone. So, but that was the reason that he gave for that. And so people that become familiar with enough say that it's readable to them. So I can only take their word for it. So
I mean, I think that is a pretty generous like view of Hoon. And not to say it's a bad language or anything. I haven't written any of the code in Hoon to tell you what it is to write in. But I think that this is another point where I think intentionally, and I will underscore this, a lot of this sort of obfuscation is intentional, to be polarizing and to be different, and we'll go into that. But I think that if you cut through the noise, you're right. It's not that different from a lot of other languages,
more obscure languages, but like ones that have come before. So it's not that different there.
Yeah, exactly. And then the last thing I'll say is just about Nock, is that Nock is a very interesting virtual machine. It's modeled, according to the original blog post, it's modeled after Maxwell's equations. So Maxwell's equations are a set of 4 equations from which you can derive a lot of physical phenomenon. And so they're sort of fundamental to physics. And so in a bit of maybe self-aggrandizing, Curtis Yarvin has likened the definition of Nock to Maxwell's equations in that it is fundamental and immutable. So while Urbit, the OS, can change, the definition of Nock is fixed, and actually, as Yarvin is very proud of, can fit on a T-shirt.
And I get the sense that it's, I mean, it's not the first place I've heard that, actually. I think he did borrow that from either Paul Graham or Alan Kay. I can't remember, but like I think
he references both.
Yes. I think it was the experience of one of them when I think it was Alan Kay, when he was learning computer programming way back when, and he saw the program listing for the Lisp interpreter written in Lisp, it would fit on one page, and he could cover it with his hand, and he was pretty amazed. And so I think with good reason that's amazing. And so I think one of the things that stands out in the examples that you see is that like the only operation is to add. And so how do you represent decrement? And so the algorithm is that you start at 0 and you count up, and you keep adding until you're one less than the number that you were at. And so obviously that's not the way that Nock is actually implemented. They do leverage whatever the underlying hardware provides. And so I think they call them jets, and they're effectively, I guess they're, I don't know what they describe jets as.
Yeah, so they're basically an optimization. So the idea behind jets is that because the Nock bytecode is so tight and compact, you can basically pattern match it, so that if you notice that there is this pattern of starting from 0 and incrementing until n-1, then a optimizer can then just say, oh, this is just decrement, and then swap it out and call out to
with a
the
native implementation.
Native implementation.
Yeah, and so to be fair to Nock, it seems like it's a lot of hullabaloo for nothing to just kind of try to have as minimal VM as possible to the point where there's actually no decrement operation. And to be fair to the project, Urbit aspires to be a computer that you can use in 100 years, that you could potentially pass to your children and grandchildren. And in order to do that, it would have to be able to be rebuilt on top of any future hardware. And the easiest way to do that is for the VM, Nock, to be as easy to implement on new hardware as possible. Because everything else, like Hoon, Avro, it's built on top of Nock. And so if you can implement Nock on any hardware, then it's effectively portable anywhere. And so I think that's a reasonable assumption. But then one of the things about Nock is that there are inefficiencies to having a VM that only increments, right? And so when you want to do things like decrement, what you do is you start from 0 and you count up from then. But obviously that's inefficient. So what Nock does is that whenever it pattern matches that Nock code is trying to do a decrement, the implementation will swap that out with a native call to the underlying hardware to actually do a decrement. So if there's a lot of these low-level optimizations that need to call out to native functions, I really wonder how portable it is, and I guess that remains to be seen. I'm not as familiar with it, and so maybe somebody that's more familiar in our audience can tell us whether it's really as portable as it claims to be, if not more than, what was the other portable one that we were talking about, seemingly? I can't remember what episodes we've done now.
Yeah, I don't know.
Plan 9? No, definitely not Plan 9. I can't remember. Anyways.
Yeah, JVM is portable.
Oh, is it? Well, it is, but it's like pretty huge, right?
Yeah.
So nobody's going to try to re-implement JVM on a whole bunch of different hardware if they can, if they have other things that they want to do. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is the impetus for getting Nock as small as possible, and definitely it has its downsides. Because for viewers interested, there's a really compelling talk by Guy Steele, one of the creators of Java, and he gave a talk called "Growing a Language," in which he takes that philosophy to task, where you want the smallest language as possible, because in order to say anything useful, you have to say a whole bunch of things that build up definitions to say stuff. And so he does the presentation in that way. Also, he starts with like defining what a man and a woman is in order to talk about different people, and so on and so forth, until he's able to actually like give an actual presentation. So it is with Hoon. So because like even though the definition can fit on a t-shirt, it takes a lot of instructions to unwrap that into something useful. And so as an optimization, they take a shortcut and call out to the underlying VM whenever possible. So
yeah. Actually, so you mentioned Guy Steele and the pain of bringing up bootstrapping a language from first principles and defining everything. Yeah. But this is the third time I've made this reference. Alan Kay is really interested in establishing interplanetary communication across species. And one of the things that he mentions a lot is this language called Linkos, which is a way to bootstrap such communication. And so I wonder what Alan Kay would think about bootstrapping computation using Nock.
Somebody did ask him on HN what he thought of Urbit, and he was just like, well, they forgot verb. I'll give him that. Mm-hmm. But he said he hasn't really looked too far into what they're doing.
Yeah. I mean, given what I know about Alan Kay's work, which is very much in the empowering individuals and democratizing computation in that way, I'm not sure if he would be a big fan of Curtis Yarvin's political views on sort of anti-democratic ideas, but we'll get to that. We'll get to all that good stuff.
Right. If anything, I think that he does. Alan Kay also has a problem with the current computing landscape as he sees it, because like if you listen to some of his talks, like he kind of takes a similar approach in that, okay, we need to build things from the ground up, in which like we did some prototype demonstrations that you can build systems in which most of the work is in a programming language or a compiler for like these higher and higher level domains. And in this way, we can drastically reduce the amount of code that we need to write. And so we've seen that demonstrated in one of our previous episodes on Hyperfiddle. And also, I guess we're seeing it here in Urbit. And so to some extent, like I think Hoon as the OS is what, 30K or so? It's definitely like not millions of lines of code that our current OSs are. So maybe there's something to be said there about Alan Kay. I think Brett Victor has called him the one of the world's most interesting philosophers, but people just don't know him. That they just think of him as this like object oriented guy. Yeah. No, actually, now that you mention it, if you go back to our Smalltalk episode, one of the motivating use cases for Smalltalk as a whole was actually the end goal was to build a tablet for children to use called Dynabook, right? And then they worked backwards from that view of the world that every child should have a computer in their hand that is accessible to them, understandable by them, and also modifiable by them, right? And they worked backwards from that goal to then rethink the programming language, the operating system, all the way, down to, kernel level optimization, and I think even hardware optimization in order to support that idea. And actually, that does sort of echo Urbit, and so this is actually a good point to step back, right? So we went deep into all of these different stuff. Well, what is this whole thing? Other way, it echoes Smalltalk, right? It's like if I said you look like your father looks like you. No, it's the other way around. Right. You look like your father.
That's right. We have to give respect to the precedents. Yes. So Urbit echoes Smalltalk in that way. In that Urbit is working towards a particular view of computing, and so maybe we can go into that. But yeah, so basically, Urbit is trying to kind of come at this from the angle of digital sovereignty. So the fundamental concept is to give users ownership over their identity in the system, and we've talked about this, and then also give them agency over their computing environment. And one way in which they strive to do this is by keeping things as simple as possible and maintainable and easy to reason about, at least from a conceptual level, if not from the detailed level. And in doing this, it sort of disintermediates corporations and other parties who might otherwise take advantage of this complexity in the system and say, okay, delegate your agency towards us. We're going to just run all this stuff for you because it's too complicated. And then you become just a user or an agent. The idea of Urbit is that you should be able to run the system and participate in this global network without having to delegate to some other party to run this as a service for you.
Yeah, and that relates to bundling, unbundling, because I mean, the bundling part is when things get centralized, and that's because there's just too much choice in too many modular parts. And the hard part in trying to do any job to be done is the consolidation and the picking of these parts to do your particular job. And that's where we are in computing right before. And then people said, well, you don't want to manage a server, we'll manage it for you. And so that's where the intermediation comes in, or disintermediation. Which one is it? Basically, somebody stepping in as a middleman for you. So by trying to keep things simple, I guess Urbit is trying to stave off the bundling of any job to be done that anybody has to do in computing.
Yeah, exactly. And so, so what does this all buy you? Well, right now, what it buys you is that if you run the Urbit OS, and this is they dub it an overlay OS. Basically, it means that it runs on top of existing Unix. I guess potentially in the future, they will have maybe a Urbit all the way down to the metal, but at least for now, it's a program that you run. And it allows you to self-host a variety of applications on your personal server and participate in the Urbit network. These applications are collaborative in nature because of the network-oriented aspect of the Ames network. So they have these digital utilities. They have a chat application. They have a collaborative text editor, or I think maybe just a normal text editor, but you can publish its contents. And then they have basically some type of like Usenet type groups such that you can associate yourself with people on the Urbit network and then chat with each other, share files, things like this. And so these are all kind of basic cloud services, but the interesting part is that they're decentralized, basically, and they're run on top of Urbit and the network as a kind of fundamental construct.
Do you know if it's actually easy to run this? Have they fulfilled their goal of being easy to run?
I actually tried to run it earlier today, and I think I have it working, and it's on my computer. I just open some DMG, and it runs fine. And I think that for now, they've had to make a lot of accommodations to their initial vision of like having this be this fully vertically integrated thing, because of course it's still running on top of a Unix system. It's not running as the host OS, right? And so they've sort of relaxed that constraint for now in order to get participation and buy-in. And then they also expose the UI of the Urbit OS via HTTP, via React frontend, which I thought was funny. And so they sort of relaxed that constraint as well, in that it's not a fully vertically integrated like windowing system or UI library that they're using. They're sort of falling back to the web. But yeah, it runs. And it's pretty basic. All the applications are pretty basic. And I think in order to really get value out of them, you have to have that identity and be a participant in the network, right? And join some groups and know other people to participate with. Otherwise, like, who are you going to chat with, right? But yeah, it works.
What everybody said about video conferencing in the 90s, like, why do I need to see who I'm calling? Because who am I going to be able to call? Just other nerds. And so nobody thought that it would be so pervasive in 2020s in a pandemic. So joke's on you, 90s commentator. So
that's true. I think that it's very reminiscent, actually, of the early internet. And they mentioned this a little bit, that some...
Urbit's a reminiscent of the early internet. Not my comment, but Urbit is.
Yeah, sorry, yes. Urbit is reminiscent of the early internet in that way, in that the only people around to talk to are Urbit nerds, right? But it does create a sense of cohesiveness. I don't know, because I still have to find some Urbit nerds to talk to, but they've done a very good job on their blog of documenting how people are using Urbit, how it feels to use Urbit. And one of the things that they mentioned is that they want to keep Urbit kind of closed, or rather to keep the communities and the interactions on Urbit within niche communities rather than this like big broadcast mechanism like Twitter or Facebook or things like that. And they're hoping that by keeping this type of interaction model, it will foil the eternal September phenomenon, which is the phrase to describe the downfall of Usenet, I believe, where every September there's a big flood of new college students who would join the network, and then they would ask stupid questions, and everybody would get annoyed, and it would ruin Usenet for everybody.
Right. And so, it would chase away the good commentators, the interesting, and then it's just when all the riffraff came in. So.
Yeah. So I think they're hoping to keep the interaction model. Basically, you could call it echo chambers. They like to call it niche communities.
Yeah. Yes. But I mean, in some sense, it makes sense. I mean, the well-known adage of startup way of getting early customers is that you want like 100 fervent customers rather than thousands of just kind of lukewarm customers. So by that sense, that they're probably doing the right thing for the network, for them.
Yeah. So this is Urbit today. Is that you can run this. The current state of Urbit, they call OS1. It provides this set of collaborative utilities, and they're hoping to evolve it to be full-fledged OS. But I think for now, actually, the Urbit community, a lot of the development and a lot of the discussion happens on Urbit, I guess, via these chats and things like that. So they're sort of bootstrapping in this way. And actually, this is a good point to sort of also bring in some of the more philosophical aspects. So the Urbit OS is trying to encode cypherpunk values into the OS. And so all of these things...
What is cypherpunk for those of us that are either too young or don't read enough sci-fi to know what it is?
Yeah, so cypherpunk is a philosophical movement of people who want to use cryptography to protect their digital independence. And so they believe
this
in
is not a new thing either, right? This was from way back in the 70s, I want to say.
Yeah, I think like 70s, 80s for sure. Yeah, and it's a very influential movement in that a lot of the early internet users identified with this philosophy. And if you look at the Wikipedia article for list of famous cypherpunks, you'll see a lot of famous names, including Mark Andreessen. I don't know who's curating this list and how they know whether they're cypherpunks, but you know, there's a lot of famous, a lot of famous folks who were foundational to the internet, the World Wide Web, as well as the early days of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and the subsequent projects. And so it's a very influential movement that believes sort of that people should have ownership over their data, ownership over their digital identity, and you can see how Urbit, if it were to take off, would advance this set of values.
Yeah, I see. That is pretty interesting. Then I guess right now it seems like what people are using Urbit for is to talk with other Urbiters, like where they kind of can find a place. I mean, like it's niche already within technology, and so it's great that they can dog food their own stuff to see what's working, what's not. But then, like, I guess as usual in the third part of our segment is that we like to talk about what the second and third order effects of a particular newish technology is. Like, what happens if we found this to be a normal thing? Like, what are the things that would happen if this was a pervasive technology and everybody thought that it was just kind of par for course? But of course, why would you not use this sort of thing? What do you think like would happen if a functional OS were readily adopted by a lot of people? Like, it's a personal computer that you could potentially pass to your grandkids.
Yeah, so I think that I really like that emphasis on the longevity of the system, because the way that the Urbit folks describe how it feels like to use Urbit, right? The human experience of using Urbit, it feels like your computer is a place. It's like your own house that you can arrange in the way that you like. You can customize it in the way that you like, and you're basically in the same way that you don't ask anybody's permission to decorate your house and you become an interior designer. You know, Urbit is a place like this. And so the way that they describe it is that there's actually a famous architect who a lot of software designers like to cite called Christopher Alexander. Have you heard of this guy?
Yes. I was wondering if it was some other architect, but I think there's only one in the software world. One. Yeah.
Yes. So Christopher Alexander is an urban planner and architect who I guess somehow made his mark on folks in the software design world for a variety of reasons. But basically, one of his philosophies is that people need a sense of space or place in order to kind of embody their culture or their own personal style or vision of the world. And so Urbit, and with all its private rooms and private chats and an operating system in which you are fully in control, gives a sense of space to computing. And so when I read this, I thought, okay, actually maybe this is a type of metaverse, because I've been like I've said this multiple times in multiple episodes. I don't think that the metaverse means a 3D environment where people are running around. I think the metaverse is exactly this. It is a digital space in which you can participate, you can modify, you can customize, and you're an empowered participant in the same way that you are in the regular world. And so maybe Urbit is a type of metaverse. If you squint and you let go of the notion of a 3D world, it is a type of world, because there are rooms and places in which you can modify and customize and build a culture.
I think it's the permanence and the control that contributes to this, right? Because the permanence is from the event log. And so you could potentially, like I said earlier, write it in cold storage somewhere and then bring it out later. And it could be restored to the state that you had your entire OS in.
Yep.
And then I guess because you own it, like actually own it, because you own the entire event log, I guess. And you own your identity. Oh, right. You own your identity. Then I guess it really limits on not only the attack surface, but also who gets to be an intermediary. I guess a lot of that is dependent on what other complicated things will happen. Because I can see somebody writing a C language in Hoon to import a whole bunch of like other stuff. I mean, if it's Turing complete, it's completely possible. So maybe I don't know. The universe of human desires is nearly infinite, and so I'm not so sure that it could be kept as such unless it stays niche. Like I can see like if it becomes the way in which, I guess if it's everywhere, like people would want to find a way to commercialize it somewhere. There's probably some aspect of the system that is a missing job to be done, in the same way that search across the internet was a missing job to be done for the entire network. And so two guys decided to build it, and it turns out that it was pretty profitable. Well, they weren't the first ones, but they were the first ones to figure out how to do it in a way where it's both profitable and it was pretty good. So I think that I don't know, my money is on that there's probably some missing job to be done on Urbit, and then you'll have to figure out how to address that in Urbit itself, or if it will let commercial interests address that for its users.
Yeah, I think there is a fundamental tension here, because Urbit claims that they want to make this OS as easy as possible. This isn't an OS for nerds. Maybe it is right now, but in their grand vision, this is something that anybody can run. Yeah. But at the same time, if you look at the way that they describe their usage pattern, it is basically based on the idea that the idea of exclusivity, right? Like, the reason why Urbit is so nice to use is that you are on these, private chats, private boards. You select into and you opt into the society that you want to interact with on Urbit, as opposed to these broadcast networks like Twitter and Facebook and whatever, right? And so, there's a tension there. Okay, well, this is an OS for everybody, but it's also an OS that is kind of cliquey, right? And so, and also it's interesting because if you, going back to the technical details, to the address space only has 4 billion addresses available to sell. And that is fewer than the number of human beings that are on Earth right now, right? And so, can everybody use Urbit? It sounds like by design they can't.
I guess the birth rate would have to go down. I don't know.
Well, birth rate would have to go down, and then the entire absolute population of the Earth would have to go down.
Well, and then we wait, I guess.
Yeah. But yeah, so I think that there is some contradiction there. And I think this isn't just a sort of by happenstance. I do suspect that actually what's happening is that the folks on Urbit are trying to build their own sort of opt-in society that is only for them, right? And gives them a sense of, permanence in space and all of this. And it's they maybe are paying a bit of lip service to the fact that they want to open this up for everybody and empower the user to have the digital independence. But I really feel like this is sort of a lot of this obfuscation and esotericness is by design to kind of draw in a certain crowd who they want to interact with and who they want to be on Urbit, and sort of keep the riffraff out.
What is this certain crowd then? What do you suppose the certain crowd in Urbit is?
Yeah, so this is where it gets a little dicey. So the history of Urbit, like we mentioned, is it was created by this guy, Curtis Yarvin. And Curtis Yarvin, like I mentioned at the top of the episode, is a bit of a controversial figure because he has some very, I would, at least to me, deeply concerning views about how to structure society. Like I mentioned, he is sort of anti-democracy and leans more towards sort of anarcho-capitalism, but also a type of like technocracy in which a elite technological class become the ruling class. And so there's sort of this hard right bent to the project, and supposedly Urbit is under the governance of the Talon Corporation, which is now under new leadership and doesn't necessarily espouse these philosophies of its original founder.
Yeah, so there is another guy, like a co-founder. I think his last name is Paul. I forgot his other name, his first name or so. But yeah, like supposedly, like he's, as a resignation letter, Yarvin has said like, okay, like the wish of any founder is that eventually they'll be able to step away because he has no wish to be a maintainer or a beneficial? No. Benevolent. No wish for dictator. a benevolent dictator for life. Yeah. So supposedly that's the case. And yeah, I guess normally it's not nearly as concerning for, I guess, people with fringe views to talk about it on the internet. I think what makes Yarvin different is that he does have the year of politicians and billionaires. I think he's knows Peter Thiel and JD Vance and who's the other guy? Blake Masters. Yeah, so I mean that's, and not only that, like his writings, political writings influence their thought. And so I think, like, does his political views filter into Urbit? And I think it's hard to disassociate the two, because like, I think the way that you might build up, especially when he built all the way to the part of the stack where people are socializing and messaging with each other, certainly those things would be influential in how you set that up.
Yeah, and again, like it filters into design. Definitely this is a social-oriented OS, right? And it is good to be critical about the effect of somebody's social view, the founder's social view, especially when it is going to become if it succeeds, it would become a mechanism of how people socialize and disseminate information, right?
And I think also one of the case in point, and I don't know if this is still true or not, but like one of the things supposedly is the way that the hierarchy of your ships, or is it planets? Like you are a planet, and then you are part of a star. And so if you are not playing well, I guess, within the star and the other planets, then you can find somebody else. And so the idea is that people can have their own little enclaves in which they talk to like-minded individuals. And so that can be good, but it can also be problematic because it just accentuates the echo chamber effect, in which you only talk to people that have your own viewpoints. And so we, on the other hand, like, we do know that when anybody can hear anybody else on Twitter, that's not the right thing either. Yeah. But like everybody being closed off themselves, I don't think is the right design either, because I think it'll only exacerbate the current problem we have in civil society today.
Yeah. And it seems like Yarvin wants this by design, right? Especially, I imagine, with this kind of fringe views that he has, maybe he's looking to create a space for folks, like-minded people, to congregate and to discuss these without getting banned from Twitter or canceled, as they say these days, right? This digital sovereignty and ownership model, certainly you can view it through a benevolent lens, but you can also see how it advances and serves the purposes of somebody like Curtis Yarvin.
Yeah. But then on the flip side, like a lot of the technologies that we have and take for granted were started by relatively controversial figures as well. For example, like the free software movement with Richard Stallman, like that guy has some pretty radical ideas. And in effect, so what are some examples of his radical ideas? Like, he feels like all software should be free. Nobody should be able to make commercial money off of software. And I think it also relates to kind of these Cypherpunk Values, in which like he made the free software foundation where like you can copy around software. It's free as in freedom, not free as in burgers or whatever, the free milk, mail,
free as in beer.
Yeah, free as in beer. And so like that is relatively different from the understanding of property, digital or otherwise, at the time. And since then, like, due to commercial interests, like, we've actually dulled it quite a bit. Like we understand it more as open source, and the way that we as mainstream commercial digital users use open source is that it's a way to organize different people and between companies to build common infrastructure, because it's really good. Open source software is really good at building common infrastructure. Not so good at building like social software. I've never seen like Twitter come out of like open source or anything like that, but definitely a lot of the stuff that it has come out. And so what are other software that are pretty radical with radical founders? Bitcoin, I guess, is another one, right?
Bitcoin. And also it comes from the cypherpunk lineage. Yeah.
Right. And so what have we seen in the like cryptocurrency space? Well, it turns out that they rebuilt a lot of the infrastructure and the trappings of the older financial system. I mean, there's some new things, like there are things that are different, but like either you could argue, well, that's why those things were in place in the first place, or like it's the same motivations of power and wealth, like motivated the same people. And so that's a good absolutely point. So but yeah, like I guess to swing back to it, like while we do, I know I personally don't agree with Yarvin's own political philosophy. I think for me, the thing to look at is whether Urbit itself has any legs technically, and whether there are good ideas we can either use or crib for other systems. And so it's like the functional ideas are not, they're not bad, and it's related to, as we mentioned, like Alan Kay and some of the cypherpunk aesthetics of Richard Stallman and Satoshi. And so we use those things in our day-to-day lives. And yeah, so that's one particular viewpoint. And I think there are examples from other non-technical things as well, right? I guess I'll mention two real quick. I guess like, I think it's well known that Dr. Seuss did not like Germans and Japanese. And it's because he was working at a time during World War II, and he drew a lot of racist propaganda images. It's just that he's most well known for children's thing. And so do I not enjoy his children's books because he did that? I don't know. It's a personal call for some people. And then subsequently, like, yeah, Newton, he's well known for like mechanics and physics and founders of optics, but like he was also into like alchemy and stuff like that. So like he was definitely dead wrong on alchemy. Like he was trying to turn lead into gold and stuff like that, in addition to his work on
and not just alchemy. He wasn't just wrong about alchemy. He also believed in like the occult and had a variety of fringe religious views as well. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so in those cases, I guess what I'm saying is I think I can like try to look at Urbit as it stands on its own merits and see whether there's something valuable there aside from the personal political leanings of its founder and creator. Yeah.
I mean, it tends to go the way that you're describing, where once sort of moneyed interests get wind of something that is potentially useful, then they sort of soften the radical idea into something that like fits their purposes. And everybody loves open source and stuff like that. But Richard Stallman didn't start out with open source. He started out with copyleft, right? The idea that like private property, at least property rights of software, shouldn't exist. So, which is pretty anti-capitalist, I would say. One thing that's interesting to me about this phenomenon of softening these radical ideas and whether it could apply here to Urbit is, we talked a lot about the obfuscation mechanism, right? Renaming everything, giving things kind of weird names.
Yeah.
And then like also hiding. I think they're not quite so upfront about calling out the lineage, right? Like you would be hard pressed to find the word functional reactive programming anywhere on their document, even though that's very clear what it is.
Right.
And I would say that all of this, as well as the kind of obscure bytecode of the Nock interpreter and everything like that, is a type of protective mechanism in which it makes it so that the interface of Urbit is the amount by which Urbit interfaces with the rest of the world, the rest of the software world, is very limited, right? And so that actually limits its attack surface in sort of resisting commodification, right? It's not all that easy for somebody to just look at Urbit and say, well, we're just going to lop off this weird social layer which advances some philosophy that we don't agree with, and we're going to use like these other middle parts of the stack or something like that. Because it's so tightly vertically integrated, it's pretty hard to find an entry point to say, okay, we're just going to steal this bit here and add it to our cloud OS, which we're going to sell.
Yeah, I think that's a good insight. Basically, it's a protection mechanism against the commodification that softens the founding philosophies going forward, right? That's what you're saying. Yeah. And so you either take all of it or none of it. You got to love all of me or none of me. You got to love me. Well, like you got, what is it?
If you don't love me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best.
Right. the most common saying on dating sites. And so perhaps it's that. And so, I mean, the only way to do that, I think, is to understand its core concepts and then re-implement it elsewhere. I think that's the only way that could actually be cribbed, to take some of that power away. But otherwise, it's take it or leave it sort of thing. Yeah.
And actually, this isn't it is a protective mechanism here, and maybe here, depending on your views of this political philosophy, it seems like maybe a insidious thing, right? But actually, we've discussed this even in the Dynamic Land episode. So Brett Victor is similarly very protective of Dynamic Land, which is his view of operating system of the future, and also tries to resist commodification, because there's a certain view of not just computing, but also about how humans interact with each other through the computing environment that he's trying to advance, right? And so that can easily get subverted by moneyed interests and corporations and venture capital money and all of that. And so he's also actually designed a variety of protective mechanisms into that operating system.
Right.
And so it's interesting to see some parallels there. I don't think that Brett Victor and Curtis Yarvin would get along. I don't know them personally, but
Right.
I feel like they are on very different ends of the spectrum, but they are using kind of similar parallel thinking. Yeah.
Right. And your advice to Brett Victor is just open it up to everybody. And I guess it's the same. I guess if you were at all consistent, it would be the same for Urbit, right? Like just re-implement it in our current systems. Yeah, like I said, it's not beyond. I mean, he spent a long time on this, and so I wonder what would happen if somebody implemented C in Hoon, so that they can compile a whole bunch of C programs on top.
Yeah, just like so you can run Emacs or something.
Yeah. So you can run Emacs and Vim and stuff like that.
Yeah. I think it could be doable, like you said. And then I also wonder, just philosophically, because Emacs and Vim come from their own philosophical lineage, right, of Unix and Bell Labs and all of that, how the Urbit community would appreciate or not appreciate the bringing of that, porting of that software to their system.
Yeah. So I don't know. So I guess it remains to be seen what that was the case. But then swinging back to our original question, I don't think we quite answered that question of like what happens if this is pervasive? Like what would you actually see? Like what's the result of, like, I guess your mom having like, Shri, I have an Urbit. I want to do X, like, or like what would it actually be? Because like the idea of personal computing that lasts for a long time, I think would change society quite a bit, right? Not just in the small sense of, well, we have these fringe, well, I don't know about fringe nowadays, but like these, I guess, like people that have views that they feel like they want to shield from other people. But like outside of that, it doesn't mean that we can't take these tools and use it for other means and ends, because like nowhere in a functional OS does it mean that you can't take it to do other things. Like what are the other things that we would do for like a personal computer that we can keep for 100 years?
I mean, one thing that I feel is a big barrier to users really getting at ease with their computer is the idea that you can break your computer really easily. Like you can install the wrong thing. You can brick it really easily. Like you can install the wrong thing, or even if you expand your idea of bricking beyond just like your operating system, you can corrupt your programs really easily, or you can get into weird software mismatches where like you were using some program, but then you updated your OS and now that old program can't run because whatever, they're incompatible. Or even you can get locked out of your accounts really easily, right? You forget your password. You never be able to log in to the centralized services and things like this. And so I can imagine as a non-technical user, just the amount of fear that you have around interacting with anything, because you get the sense that whatever you have, you need to like preserve and be like dance very carefully around interacting with anything, because you can lose it very easily. Whereas, if you look at Urbit, the idea that it's a functional OS that can apply operating system updates, and the fact that you own this identity, right? And presumably that means there's no service to get locked out of. All of this, I can imagine, is more empowering and will enable users to interact with their computing more boldly.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where it's the Stockholm syndrome, where it's like been like that for such a long time, you don't actually notice that it's a problem. But yeah, I mean, I think for you and I, we know enough to actually restore some things, and we're only susceptible to big things like dropping our production database per se. We know that most everything else we can either like reboot, reinstall, or reset. But like I think it's easy to forget that for most average user, like the reason why web apps are so nice is because all of that is taken care of for you, right? Because before that, when you have your own personal computer back in the 90s, like you install a virus, or like you don't know what the hell happened, and like your computer is slow now, but like you got to take it into the shop. It's just I don't know. It's just too much, because like everybody has a job to be done that is not computing. And so they're trying to use computers for that thing. But like if they can't, or it's too complicated, they either hire somebody else, or I guess they get frustrated, throw it away. Most people are not going to like, okay, let's grind it out and break out the manual to see what's going on underneath the covers.
Yeah, or they learn exactly the sequence of patterns they need in order to get that one thing done, and then they don't know at all how to interact with the rest of their computer. Right,
exactly. I've seen that for users of NetSuite, where like they remembered the sequence of menus, or like whatever the search bar they had to reach a particular feature, and that's it. That's how they navigate. Because like I can't say I really like NetSuite's interface because I thought it was too complicated. But for people that learn that one path to the one feature that they use, they're just like, I'm set. Like, I don't need to, like, I don't need this to be simpler because I just need it to be the same.
Yeah, no, and it's really surprising how common it is. So in my day job, I build software that is used by, in hospital settings, by doctors and nurses and people like this who have very, very important jobs to be doing that don't involve mucking around with computing. And again, I think that pattern is there of nobody really likes their tools. Like, nobody's a fan of the medical record software that their hospital decided to buy or whatever, but they learn their pattern. And like you said, don't change it, right? If the software updates, they get lost because the things are not in the same place. Or if they change their software system, so much amount of the budget for that software upgrade goes towards training and retraining people to use the software, because basically they've learned it by rote. They like somehow some way in which they've learned to use computing is just treat it as a magic sequence and only do that thing, because if you don't do that thing, then you're going to break your system and it's not going to be good.
I see. It's almost like an incantation. I guess we were wondering like what it would be like to live in the world of Harry Potter. It would be like that. Like, most people treat the commands of menus or whatever they have to type as a magic sequence as a unit. And of course they would be frustrated when it breaks, because it's almost as if the physical rules of the physical world broke in a magical world.
Yeah, if you like accidentally mumbled the wrong thing, right, then like you broke your world, right? So now it's very scary. You don't want to get it wrong. Yeah, so I can imagine that, like if everybody had Urbit, then one, I think the
you can
surface,
undo, right?
You can undo, yeah.
That's the main point, because it's a functional, everything else, the code is functional and the state is a sequence event log. And so if you mess something up, you can just like step one back and redo it. Actually, I wonder how that works if you transmitted that event across the network. Does that event transmit it, or events are always
transmit?
Yeah, you can't untransmit it. So, but because you do get events from across the network. I guess that's the thing I hadn't thought too hard about, but maybe maybe like all events are local, and then so if something came in that is a mistake, they just record it as a mistake, and then on replay they ignore it again. Maybe something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I guess if you've received an event before, then when you catch up, you know not to reprocess it.
Not to do something about it.
Well,
anyways, that is a detail for maybe like if we cover it again after having much more experience with it, we can cover it. But I think the surface area is so large, we can leave that for a later possible episode and go back to this. But yeah, like the ability to undo, because I think in the same way that like saving is unknown to a lot of younger computer users now, because apps save automatically. They actually don't know what floppy disks are either. So they're just like, I don't know what this means, because they think of things not in files but in apps. And so it's kind of almost I guess it caters to people's mental models of their work, that like their work is sitting in one place rather than as files to interchange. Although I feel like maybe one day people will regret not thinking about things as files, because then that means you can move your data around, right?
Yeah. Well, so that's the interesting thing about Urbit is that, I mean, it does have a sense of a file system and things, but yeah, the state of the system is just a single unit, right? And but because of the fact that you can persist that log and then also associate it with your identity, like you said, you can maybe take your Urbit ship and run it on a different computer. So like, let's say your actual physical hardware on which you're running this Urbit ship fails, provided that you backed it up somewhere, you could restore that back up onto a different physical device, and you'll be back and running with the same OS state as you were on the other device. And so in that sense, it's also kind of liberating, because now you have a logical computer, right? That is not connected to your physical computer, whereas that's not the case today.
Right. Yeah, and that means that you should be able to transmit it. I mean, I think they're relatively big, but you should be able to transmit that across space and time as well. I guess coupled with our earlier episode of the text editor for your mind, like Roam Research, like if you have a machine learning algorithm that records your messages as you type, it should be able to generate text as if it were you. And so effectively it's almost like an artifact that soul binds you to your computer, or like takes a copy, right? And so with Urbit now, you could conceivably be resurrected, or at least some copy of you, like resurrected in the future. Because like we think of it before as somebody is able to talk to you through your generated messages even after you're dead. But now you could be doing that even, I don't know, 1,000 years into the future, 10,000 years into the future.
I see.
A little strange to look at because the time horizon is much, much longer. And so I wonder if A, anything you have to say would still be relevant, but also B, I guess it's for archaeology or like archaeological relevance. It would be really interesting if like we had something similar for Abe Lincoln or Albert Einstein, like that question of like who would you lunch with, alive or dead, could actually be a thing for like grade school students to experience, right?
Yeah. So I see what you're saying. So basically, if you have that the model, the language model, and then you use the Urbit OS as a kind of container format, right, which contains not just that model, but then also the data. Maybe you have the Abe Lincoln's like personal diary files, from which that model can like
be trained on to generate the text that would be what you would most likely type. And also like Urbit is a social platform and messaging platform, so you would do most of your communications through there also, right?
Oh, so you could just run a headless like Urbit OS that is running a language model and then taking its output and then sending it into the Urbit network into chat rooms or something.
You could do that in the
Ghost Abe Lincoln can like chat with people on
Urbit. Yeah. In the near term also. So that's I guess that would be a possibility also. Yeah.
That is pretty interesting. And actually this is going back to episode 1. We did talk about what if you could do this and earn money, right? So what if you could sort of put your thoughts out into the world into a global hypertext, right? And then people would be able to pay you for this, and this is a way in which you earn money from contributing your ideas into a global knowledge store. And actually, this is potentially feasibly powered by Urbit as well, because from what I read, they are baking in a Bitcoin wallet as a first-class entity into the Urbit OS, so that you can actually perform some types of transactions and commerce that's backed by Bitcoin at the OS level. And so, I think maybe you could even perform some activities and get paid for them. It's kind of like that money REPL idea from episode 1. Maybe this is too deep of a reference, but
no, we want our viewers to get as deep in our self-referential as possible. It's just to rake them into a network of self-referentiation. Yeah, actually, like it makes me wonder then if like the payment is built into the network. That's something the internet was missing for a long time, and that's why we turned to ads as a way to monetize the commercial interests of the internet. And so what would happen for a network that has payment already built in? Like how would services work? Like would you still have SaaS and then you would just pay for services? Like so would somebody set up, like I can't imagine that, like if payment's already built in, like what sort of services would people pay for? One is like basically like the items that somebody has, whether digital or other thing. But then like for services, like could you set up an app on your server and then people pay you for copies of that app to run now and for updates in the future? But then the data that the app operates on happens on your own computer, which I think is the point of Urbit, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's certainly a type of commerce that could happen, because a lot of what they describe with building Bitcoin into Urbit is it will enable certain types of transactions, like being able to sell content, because presumably you can host some content on your Urbit chip and encrypt it and then not give the encryption keys, the decryption key, unless you received some payment or something like that, right? And so you can imagine selling copies of software this way, or selling copies of any kind of content this way, by just saying, okay, it is publicly accessible on the Urbit network, but you only get the keys to, decrypt this if you pay me via these microtransactions.
Wouldn't you just sell NFTs and then the Urbit would check the NFTs for whether you'd actually own the license to it to be able to use it or not? But then I don't know, that would have to be baked into the Urbit OS itself. And so I don't know.
Yeah,
could you fork? Like people that don't want to pay would have to end up forking the OS so that they, I don't know,
to remove the DRM check. Yeah, I feel like that's sort of antithetical to this philosophy of Urbit. Like I think that presumably once you
definitely. I guess I was thinking of like going down the path of commercialization that the internet has. What would it look like if a network already had payments? Like what what would commerce look like on here? Because if it's already pervasive, people definitely would want to transact with each other for various like goods and services that they have. And so would it follow the same path of commercialization, the internet, with the consolidation of power, or would it not? Like, would it consolidate along some other dimension besides like code and data being in the same place on servers, or something else?
Right now, because of two things, identity is not baked into the internet, right? And payments is not baked into the internet.
And Urbit has both.
And Urbit has both. So one pattern that arose on the web is that you would have identity providers and payment providers that would become the middlemen to a lot of the transactions that people wanted to perform on the web, right? So you have aggregators like Airbnb and Uber and eBay and all of that stuff, right? And so I think that because these two things are baked into the internet, now you don't need an identity provider, and we don't need a shared identity provider like Facebook for me to know who you are and for you to know who I am. We just have our Urbit IDs and we can just transact. Then I think that there will probably be commercial entities, but they will not look like those types of aggregators and those types of middlemen. But I think that one thing I could see is that because Urbit is so scattered, right? Like there is no single feed or single platform that everybody's participating in, then it causes sort of a discovery problem, right? If I want to sell some good, then how do I know, or how do people find out about me, right? So probably the intermediary or the commercial entity that will arise might be some type of indexer, Google for Urbit, where you can find out who is posting up what. You will transact with them directly using the primitives of the system, but to find them, you would need to go through some third party.
Yeah, they didn't build in search, so then it's ripe for somebody else to come and build search as a service, which can then, I guess. But then it's, how do they ship they would have to ship the code to everybody, and payment would be for promise of future updates. And data is on everybody's personal thing, so you can't. I guess that means that unless people participate on their own, you wouldn't know what their keyword searches are, and thus you can't do auction for ads or something like that.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how it would work. I mean, I imagine you could structure it the standard crypto way, where in order to service your request, like you would send your request to some nodes, and in order to service your request, you'd have to send it along with some coin, which the network providers own some of, and so they make money off of the demand for that coin.
I see. Right. So then it's more, I guess, all the things that maybe instead of like ads and privacy breaking things, you just get a lot more scammy coins out there.
Yeah. So you have to buy like search coin in order to use the search application on Urbit or something. Yeah.
And then, well, if there's a proliferation of coins, I can see a service in which like somebody promises you like a interoperable coin or like a bridge coin in which you can trade it for like whatever search coin or like email coin you need to use in that instance, right? But then you can freely trade it in that interoperable coin. Would that be Bitcoin? I guess so. I mean, like people might make their own coins. Like the interoperable coin is Bitcoin, and then the service is that we'll trade it into whatever service level token that you need at that moment so that you can get the price. And then even better is if a service would do the trading in anticipation of your needs so that you can get the best price. Because I think like airlines do that, right? They buy oil in anticipation of their needs so that they get the best price today rather than when they actually need it.
Right. So basically then the money comes from providing liquidity and futures and all this financial instruments.
Yeah, basically all the things that we see going on in crypto right now may be the type of commercialization that would happen on Urbit. Yeah.
Which is the promise of all of these coins and all these random networks, is that presumably they're providing some utility, right? But the thing is that all these Web3 utility services are not like really built in. They're not really native to the computing environment that we use, right? But maybe with Urbit, because of its emphasis on decentralization and data ownership and everything like that, then if everybody's using this type of OS, then you would want to use all these coins to transact with these services.
Yeah, basically like the financial environment is just like crypto, but even more crazy. Because like I can see like fluctuations in prices and like people doing pump and dumps, and there's no real way to do regulation on this sort of stuff either. Would there?
Yeah, I mean, presumably, if this actually backed by real usage, like
Yeah.
you are providing a real search service, which there is legitimate demand for by Urbit users, then that will stabilize the prices, right, and not make it so volatile and speculative. But like, yeah, I mean, that's
No, but
thinking, I
then
guess.
there are other types of like schemes in like in like these financial systems that have since been regulated out of the system, and for good reason, right? Like for example, front running is should not, like it's clever, but like it's not fair for the person that's doing the buying and selling.
Yeah.
So like, you know, like all these schemes were tried in the 20s and they've been outlawed or regulated away, and then in crypto we just rediscover them all over again. And we, if there's no way to, yeah, I'm not sure what the angle of reinforcement on Urbit is at the moment. There's probably
Mhm.
something.
Yeah. Yeah.
But well,
I mean,
the thing, I think the thing is, the thing that I guess going, the reason why I'm going down this path is because I think in the small, everybody wants their own freedom to do whatever they want, talk about whatever they want. And I think the needs and patterns of society as a whole is a little bit larger than that, because on one hand, when you say anybody can use crypto to transact, sure, like people think about like buying weed, but then like on the other hand, state level actors are a thing now in the space. And one of the reasons why the US is able to keep some more authoritarian governments at bay is due to the ability to enforce economic sanctions. And so that's like, whether, I mean, I guess this is where the personal thing comes through. Like, I prefer living in a liberal democracy. You may not, but you know, like that is a consideration for how society is constructed, so that we can do some types of regulation to do certain kinds of protection. And so I guess people will argue about the merits and the degree, but I don't think I think it's going too far if it's just everything is just completely unregulated. So yeah, I don't know.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's the, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, but this is where the politics and philosophy
Right.
meet the system design. Like this is exactly where it's not an abstract concept, some hand wavy thing. Design decisions like data ownership, as well as making identity and payment of first class entities in the operating system, all of those interact with broader society and social structure, which is, I think, what you're saying.
Yeah, and also that more and more technology, because it's so pervasive in our lives, software is so pervasive in our lives, it will increasingly also be a political stance. Whereas before, I guess people could write it off as just some nerds doing some stuff on the side, but increasingly now, I think it structures our society, and so lots of people will have lots to say about it.
Yeah. I mean, there's going back to the question of like, what does this mean? Just a few other things that come to mind if everybody has Urbit. I think the idea of having a globally identifiable address that is yours across all applications and everywhere on the network is really powerful, because right now we have like multiple identities. I have a Facebook ID, LinkedIn ID, Twitter, email. Early on when we were collaborating on this podcast, we would, sometimes send things via email, sometimes by text, sometimes by Twitter DMs, because that was what was most convenient at that time.
Well,
right?
supposedly, Beeper is supposed to solve all that. And so for those of us that want to learn more about that, you should go back to season 3, episode 1 to hear us talk with Eric about Beeper to solve that very problem.
Yeah. So that's, Beeper is one approach, which I think is going to happen in the nearer term than Urbit. But, you can also think in the Urbit world, once you know your friend's Urbit ID, then you can just send them everything that way, right? So you can send them blogs, texts, whatever it is. You just sort of send it to that address, and presumably they have the right application on the receiving end to view that content. So it's no longer about, the content is no longer tied to an application, actually, like you're saying, right? So, your data doesn't live in apps, actually. It just lives, your data is data. It gets sent to an address, and then it's up to the receiving end to view that data in the appropriate application, and maybe they can use alternative clients and alternative front ends for the same data.
Do you know whether, like, why could you do this with other identity providers like ENS? I think this is something you've given a little bit of thought to.
why could you not do this with ENS?
Yeah.
Well, so I mean, I think ENS is interesting, but it's not actually tied to any routing mechanism. Is one thing, right?
Oh, I see. Like other systems would have to implement the route, like basically would have to recognize it as an authority in like what the name represents. So nobody's doing that at the moment, and so until it does,
so basically,
yeah.
So Urbit has the Ames network, and Ames is not only uses the identity provider, but it is also the routing that actually will deliver that to you. Whereas I think with ENS, you could use ENS, but then you still have to send the data over some other backbone, right? Like whether that's TCP/IP or email or whatever, some other thing.
I see.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's the other thing, and again, that's sort of empowering because if you think about how people use computing today, like one of the reasons why iMessage has really taken off is that if you know your friend's phone number, you can establish a pretty powerful chat protocol with them, right? Or even WhatsApp, right? It is the same way. They have this nice human shareable identifier to establish a link with somebody. But of course, both of these run through proprietary services and proprietary identity providers. So the Urbit IDs can be converted into a human pronounceable string, kind of a randomly generated human pronounceable string. And so you can say that to your friend, they'll type it into their device, and then be able to establish a communication channel with you.
Yeah. So I was thinking about personal computing, and I've always come across it in various contexts, but more in the personal empowerment sort of view that Alan Kay and other computing pioneers have talked about. But for Urbit, it feels a little bit different in that it's like an actual physical computer. So I wonder if it's actually meaningfully different from the point of view of Urbit of having an actual physical computer available to you that's yours, kind of in the same way that if before cell phones and smartphones, when we talked about having a laptop always on you as a stand-in for mobile computing, it just didn't quite jive, right? Because like the idea of having a laptop always on you, like you think, well, I guess I can write email all the time, but like it doesn't translate to the experience of like being able to call an Uber or being able to text message your friends like a group message, or it doesn't really communicate Snapchat, right? And so I guess thinking by analogy, if you have a personal computer that's effectively you, then I guess one weird thing is what we already talked about before is that identity could be a stand-in for you in the future. And so that's one. I guess the other is that it's a place. So it's kind of like your house. And so it's the digital interface by which you interact with the digital world, right? It's kind of like almost like a second skin. I don't know how else to describe it. Like if I try to imagine it, but do you get what I'm talking about, right? Because like from our standpoint right here, our computer is like a separate thing that we go to, even our like mobile phones, but like it exists as a physical thing. And so just as it was hard for us to imagine the experience of using a mobile phone when at best we had laptops, like I think it's similarly hard to imagine like an always on personal computer that is immune to the underlying hardware and we can just move everywhere. And so I guess that's kind of the thread I'm thinking out loud. Like what would that be like? I guess it could be a stand-in for me in the sense that I can set up shop and people can buy directly from me or interact with me, not just in an email sort of way or like a text message sort of way, but like if they maybe like you could, like if you want to know my resume, you wouldn't go to LinkedIn. You would go to my identity and ask me for it. And then whether I produce it for you or not by hand is one thing, but maybe there's an app that I run that automatically generates a resume of the places I've worked for myself, or like summarizes the data on my computer to give to this person. And so all I have to do is give permission.
Yeah, and maybe depending on who's asking, you give a different response, a different resume or a different output, right? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I like this direction because if you've read these fantasy novels, his Dark Materials, there's basically in this world, everybody has it.
By? What's the series
by
called?
Philip Pullman, his Dark Materials.
I see.
And in this world, basically, everybody has a daemon or a demon.
Oh yeah, it's like JoJo Bizarre's Adventure.
Yeah, so you have like a companion who's there and in some sense is innately linked to you and your identity. It's not you, right? But it represents you, right? And maybe remembers your things for you, can act on your behalf, all of these things. And so I think from what you're saying is that this computer is almost plays that role, right? Where it is somehow you're the repository of your knowledge, the repository of your memories and thoughts. Maybe it can also, given those things, act on your behalf. And then I think another interesting aspect of this is going back to this point about the logical computer versus a physical computer.
Mm-hmm.
I think you brought it up in one of the earlier episodes that it would be really cool to have a ubiquitous computer where you walk up to anything, a terminal, any computing device that has computing capability, and then imagine that your Urbit logical computer is somehow authenticated onto that device. And now you use that, your own home, your own place, your own Urbit ship to then interact with the capabilities of whatever new computer you're looking at. So then when you walk around the world and you interact with a touch screen to order some food, or you walk into work and you go to your terminal there, rather than a variety of disparate computing devices that you're using, you actually are always interacting with something that feels familiar to you.
Yeah. You would be the single point in which all services would try to flow through.
Mm-hmm.
I can imagine that being overwhelming.
Why would that be overwhelming? I feel like it'd be comforting because you see your own computer everywhere.
Oh, you see your own computer everywhere, but then all sorts of applications and services are asking you for permission to access your stuff or to use it. Or like if you want to use some sort of service, you're like, give me permission, and you may not necessarily know or understand which part of your data is actually being asked for. I don't know. That has to be much more clear.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I think that could be confusing, and I think it'd have to be structured the right way. Yeah, I was imagining that
right,
like somehow
you just walk up to it and
you walk up to it, and then based on the capabilities, like let's say it's a vending machine.
Yeah.
Then that vending machine says I have the capability to accept payment and vend, right? And so then your Urbit ship maybe detects those capabilities and then presents an interface to you that enables you to enact that capability, rather than you using some foreign interface that somebody else designed. So I think the permissions model and the way that it's presented to the user as an affordance, I think would have to be inverted. Otherwise, it would constantly feel like you're walking up to foreign devices that are trying to probe into you. Yeah. Whereas I'm thinking it should feel like capabilities are flowing outward from your device and into the hardware.
Right. It should feel like your spirit is inhabiting the new device that you're walking up to, rather than things injecting themselves into you. Yeah.
Yeah,
I get what you're saying. Like in a magical fantasy, like hand waving sci-fi sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, and we'll see if it can be implemented that way. But I think it's a powerful idea, right? Just the idea that you can have a computer that's not tied to any one thing, right? And then it represents something much more profound, right?
Yeah.
It represents you in a sense, and then it can manifest itself in a variety of ways. It can be stored in the cloud. It can run on any device. It can be persisted and then restored and hydrated, copied. Yeah, all of those things.
So then, I think these identities can be pseudo-anonymous, right?
Yeah, I think they are anonymous by default in that it's just an address. You don't know who it is.
Because then you could get flagged. Oh, I guess there'll be like de-anonymization services that people are willing to pay for. And so like gathering data across... like gathering transactional data and services across. Do you know if they have like a global ledger like Bitcoin does, or?
No, they don't have a global ledger.
Yeah, that might make it even more enticing for somebody to build that sort of thing and sell access to it as a way to de-anonymize people. Because I was wondering, like, what about like a combination of a de-anonymizer and a social credit? Because like if you're doing like in China, social credit, because if you have an identity and it's hard to jump from one to the other, then you might be perma-banned from a lot of services for, I don't know, however long. And so nobody would actually be in prison. They would just be denied services in their day-to-day life. Sorry, no running water for you. The portal potty's not back, or whatever it is.
Right. Yeah. And I think that like the DAOs have this problem today, actually, right? Yeah. Like, how do you transfer your reputation within a DAO? How do you know who is who? But like maybe each DAO can keep track of that. But then when you move across DAOs and do work across DAOs, how do you know who's who and who's reliable, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that there is, again, this, people are trying to implement some type of social credit system, again, decentralized, but it's some ledger that says that mapping, basically what you're saying, between some address and reputation score or reviews, or I don't know, like a band status.
Yeah. So I can say, like, after thinking about it for a little while, like, there's definitely going to be commercial services that centralize something about the Urbit network that isn't providing a job to be done that people would want. So I think there is one. That's one thing. And it's up to, I guess, Urbit to see what they're going to do about that, because I guess it's a consistent fight against bundling. And so maybe there's a fighting chance because they actually have a way as an open source thing to make money by selling the identity.
Mm-hmm.
And so then that might be able to fund things. As the platform owner, you see what the most popular application is and you just implement that and own it. And so that's kind of like what Microsoft does. So that's one. The other thing is the personal extension of personal self across space and time. That I think is strange to my ears right now, but I think that might be something that would be available. Oh, like it'd be weird for dating. Like if you're right, like you don't actually have to go on the date. Like your identity and your like date's identity go and get together and run down the list of things whether they match or not. I mean, that's effectively what it is, right? To see if they have chemistry. I mean, it could be, that's kind of like how OkCupid works nowadays, but like you could conceivably have, I guess, see if your like generated texts jive with each other and do some sort of like semantic analysis on that to see like whether that's compatible as a first filter. And then you actually have the actual date where the source, like you and the actual real life person would converse. Yeah. So it would be like a frontline filter. It's kind of like LeetCode exercises as like a frontline filter for programmers. And maybe that's just a way to do that. And so that is kind of weird. And then third is kind of where, I guess, the financial aspects of where the network has payment already. And so maybe it would look like the crypto ecosystem right now. And so I think these are kind of strange futures. And they do relate to some of the other technologies that we're seeing with like the DAOs, cryptocurrencies, and it all just ends up being a really weird world. And I don't know if... Oh, I guess the other thing I was thinking is that these basic building blocks would... I think we mentioned this in the DAO episode, that these are building blocks for people to create like new social groups, like ways of organizing. And so not just at the organization level with DAOs, but like interpersonally and in small tribes up to nation states potentially. And so that is all, I guess, a real possibility with this sort of stuff. So it's a far cry from like personal computing in the Alan Kay sense, or from the... Who's the Mindstorms guy? The
Seymour Papert?
Yeah, Seymour Papert sense. This is kind of more a digital extension of the self, where the digital is copyable and it persists across space and time. It's weird.
Yeah. I think once you start layering on, other technologies as building blocks and start to weave them into this, like it becomes even a crazier world. And so as soon as you bring in AI, as soon as you bring in cryptocurrency and DAOs and all these other ideas, then actually this starts looking really, really interesting. Like right now in its current state, it's a kind of a bizarre toy for maybe some fringe type folks. But like once you start to layer in some other things, this is a very interesting future.
We should really get science fiction writers as listeners.
Yeah. So I mean, if you follow this line of thought to its logical end, it poses a very, very interesting form of computing, but also a new ways of social interaction, new ways of organizing people, and then also provides opportunities for other players to provide services, right? Like where does the value get created in a world in which everybody has a personal computing device? I think, like you said, maybe in a social credit system, in other types of aggregators that are different from the kinds that we see today. So I mean, I think that Urbit comes from controversial roots, but if you think about it just even from as a thought exercise about how can something as concrete as an operating system really change the trajectory of a society, right? How can something as concrete as computing affect the way in which people relate to each other? I think that Urbit is a great example of that. And so, I think whatever you think of the founder and his views, And whatever you think about the esoteric nature of this operating system and whether it's viable, I think that it's great to, as technologists, for us to think about what is the interface between computing and society.
Yeah. And generally, like when we're pre-gaming, I told you that generally I don't talk too much politics, but I think more and more when we think about the future of technology, it's going to be intertwined with politics, because I think politics at its core is about how people should live together, I guess is the succinct way that I would put it. And people disagree on how people should live together. And I guess the mechanism by which we decide how we all should live going forward is politics. And because software is more and more pervasive in our lives, it's becoming a louder and louder voice in that discussion, and not just the people that use it, but the people that build it.
Yeah, we've gone through Urbit from a technical perspective and through all its implications. And yeah, so how are you feeling about Urbit overall?
I can't say that, I can't say that I am to the moon on this one, in the sense that I think its roots definitely give me pause. But then one of the things that I talked about earlier was that there are plenty of technologies that I use day to day that have softened from its roots, and I don't give it a second thought. And so, but then also too, I think there are interesting ideas that Urbit cribs from other places that it implements in a concrete way that demonstrates that, hey, this stuff works and is feasible. And I think the rest of the technology ecosystem could probably take a couple notes from there if they can get through the parts of obfuscation, which I don't think really does Urbit any favors in terms of mainstreaming, but I understand that it was there to select for certain early adopters early on, and that may just be a legacy that it has going forward. So yeah, I don't know. I think, but to summarize, I think the important thing going forward is its influence on architecture, like a pure functional sense, and then the other thing is an experiment in how people would socially interact in this sort of digital realm. I would say that those are the two places in which I would expect it to have a lot of influence in both technical systems and our social systems going forward.
So with that, that's another episode of the Technium. Give us a like or subscribe on YouTube. Write us a review on your favorite podcasting app aggregator to help other people find us. And join us next week for another episode, another look into the future of computing.
That's right. All right. That's all we got this week. Like Sri said, give us some love, and we'll see you again next week for another episode of the Technium. See ya. Bye-bye.